I want to welcome you to the Feminist Speaker Research Series, which is part of the WGS and the Intersectional IIS, Institute for Intersectional Studies. We are super excited to be here to listen to Dr. Lara Karaian from Carleton University, the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice. This talk, Love Machine, Queer Feminist Encounters with the Inhuman Robotic Kind. I want to, at this moment, invite our wonderful, fantastic chair, Dr. Talia Welsh, who will do our territorial statement.
Thanks everybody for being here, and thanks for sitting through the tech issues, but I think it's going if nobody touches that computer. It'll be good. So I just want to acknowledge that we're in Treaty 6 territory, as well as within Métis homelands and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. Acknowledging traditional territory is one and very small and very insufficient part, but of recognizing and moving beyond colonization and strengthening our relations in, I think, hopefully a positive way. We want to honor the ancestors and children who've been buried here on these lands. We want to honor the missing and murdered Indigenous women, men, and two-spirits. We honor the process of ongoing truth-telling and healing for all human beings. And so we're reminded, I hope, by this acknowledgement that we're all treaty people and we all have the rights and responsibilities that come with that. So thank you, Lara, for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Awesome, thank you. And I also want to acknowledge Dr. Chloe Taylor, who has really been the front runner in helping us set up this talk and inviting Dr. Lara Karaian. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here in person, but yeah, we just want to make sure that she gets her kudos because she really put a lot of work into this. And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Lara Karaian, who is an associate professor and the current director of the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Carleton University. Her research examines the intersections between sexuality, technology, and law. Dr. Karaian's current SSHRC-funded research explores how sex tech, sex robots, virtual reality, AI, and haptic technologies affect our understanding of sex and sex crime. She has published in top-tier journals on topics such as sex robots, sexual fantasies, censorship of queer pornography, teenage sexting, child pornography, sex exploitation, self-surveillance, pregnant men, and anti-discrimination law. If any of those areas are interesting to you, definitely check out her work. Dr. Karaian is an editorial board member of the Journal of Porn Studies and a blogger at Toronto Metropolitan University's Center for Free Expression. She has served as an expert consultant for national and international governmental studies on teenage sexting, cyber violence, and youth's access to online pornography, and legal cases involving teens' intimate image creation and distribution. We are so privileged to have Dr. Lara Karaian join us today. Thank you so much.
Everyone. Okay, so thank you so much. I do also want to do my own thanks and my own acknowledgements, but I really appreciate those that you've already given. So I really, I'm just going to start. So I do want to thank Chloe, Talia, Domale, and the Department of Women's Studies, and of course Kyler as well, for inviting me to give this year's Valentine's Day with Feminism Lecture. And I just want to thank everyone who's come out and who's watching online. I would like to also begin by respectfully acknowledge that we're on the territories of the Nehio, the Niitsitapi, Métis, Nakota, Dene, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, lands that are known as part of Treaty 6, 7, and 8 and are the homeland of the Métis. And I'm very thankful to be engaging with you as a settler and a scholar on this land that continues to benefit from Indigenous lands, and I'm committed to learning, unlearning, teaching, and acting in the name of decolonial and social justice and substantive change. And this talk doesn't explicitly cite Indigenous scholars, but I'm deeply indebted to Indigenous teachings about relationality, more than human kinship, the decentering of the Eurocentric Western idea of the human. And, you know, I think anti-colonialism is increasingly core to my thinking about sexuality, technology, and governance, but also about how these new technologies are affecting and what they mean for land, water, ecosystems that we're all a part of. So we have to think about all of that, right? Okay, so my title is called Love Machine, Queer Feminist Encounters with the Human, Inhuman, Robotic Kind. And my aim today is to introduce you to sex robots, those of you who are not familiar, and then also more specifically to the fantasy of sex robots. And then I also want to invite you to envision them as queer, as queering, as offering opportunities for us to explore our erotic desires, our subjectivities, to destabilize and decenter the Euro-Western and techno-Orientalist ideas of the human, and to destigmatize public, commercial, and technosexuality. So I'm asking a lot. Okay, but I want to start with a story because I love literature. And I'm going to start with a story, so just relax. This is Samantha, an excerpt from Samantha Hunt's 2017 short story, Love Machine. It's one of the inspirations for this research, and this title's Talk. And what I'm going to read now is part synopsis, part quotes, but I'm not going to tell you when the quotes start, just so I don't break the flow, okay? So Love Machine begins with Wayne and Dwight, two young men who live at the bottom of a nuclear missile silo. Their job is to push the button when it comes time for nuclear apocalypse. Wayne and Dwight come to love each other in a quiet and unspoken way. They never act on this love. Time passes, and Wayne moves to the FBI and Operation Bombshell, the development of an explosive female robot that is described as his brainchild. We later meet Wayne and Bombshell in a van in the Montana woods down the road from one of America's most wanted. Wayne needs to nab this scumbag to show up the agents who joked about him and Operation Bombshell behind closed doors. So leaning back in his van, Wayne rubs a small swatch of Bombshell's silicone skin. He inhales her faint plastic scent, recalling moments of bliss as he selected an outfit for her to wear, stuffed her body cavity full of explosives, and then saluted her as she signed off for her first and last mission. Later, through headphones, Wayne listens to Bombshell charm her target. He could listen to her all day. Her awkward, unknowing way with language, how she accents the wrong syllables, is adorable. The Bureau thought of everything. Her anatomy is complete and flawless. She is beyond perfection. She's more than a woman. She's ageless. Her thighs will always be tight. Her cheeks will always stay soft and moderately blushed. Jealousy wells up in him. Bombshell returns to the van and says, "Wayne, you were supposed to detonate me while I was in the cabin." And Wayne replies, "I know. You failed in your duty to serve the United States of America. There will be consequences," she says. "I know," Wayne answers, and reaches out to hold her cheek in his hand. She doesn't move away. She's programmed not to resist male advances. He wraps his hand around her waist under her flannel shirt and pulls her closer, feeling the silicone lumps that are her breasts pushed into him. He smells the chalk of her scent while her arms remain limp by her sides. "Hold me," he commands her, though he feels immediately ashamed, desperate. "Still, hold me," he repeats. She complies and wraps her mechanical arms around him while he speaks words of loving sweetness into her ear, the ones she's been waiting to hear. Hot breath against plastic. Wayne whispers the magic words that send a repressed tremor through the night, an explosion that could only be described as American. So in my estimation, Love Machine beautifully captures our ambivalencies about sex robots' enlivening pleasures and their eradicating dangers. The story's beginning hints at a forbidden male intimacy, and the story middle nods to feminist fears that sex robots objectify women, eroticize social domination, normalize and promote sexual control and violence. The story's ending exemplifies broader sexual anxieties about our leap from private orgasm, le petit mort, a temporary affective state likened to death, to robopocalypse, our permanent physical annihilation as individuals and species, right? So here you can see that in some media coverage. Sex robots are coming this January and could kill you, surprising no one. So this is the general kind of fear that we have. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, so eschewing any fixed meaning. So I'm actually not going to talk about bombshell too much, but I'm just going to say there's a really interesting etymology about bombshell. And if you want to ask me about that later, we can talk about that. But I just want to let you know that, the blonde bombshell has many multiple meanings as it comes down to the robot. Okay, so eschewing any fixed meaning, the story can be read as a critique of cis-heteropatriarchal injury, objectification, and domination, or as an opportunity to imagine non-normative networks of affection and altruist sexualities, including those that lie between the platonic and the romantic, or between what I call carbon sexuality, which is a sexual preference for organic life, and what others have called techno or digisexuality, right? The attraction to, the veneration of, and the use of synthetic technology for sexual and intimate purposes. But ultimately, I think the story invites us to analyze sex, shame, love, and the human. Okay, so today I want to consider how bodies and technologies interact with, collapse into, if not, and collapse into one another, if not exploding, then at least destabilizing dichotomies such as subject-object, mind-body, human-machine, animate-inanimate, fantasy-reality, and legal and illegal. And because I am forever an optimist and a lover of a good reparative reading, I want us to reflect on alternative, effective relations and ways of knowing and being that sex robots can help open up for us. And so I'm going to ground my talk in some reflections on sex robots ontology, their relationship to sexual fantasy and to sex work, and then their implications for our legal landscape. So, great. Okay, so to be clear, so this is from today. You have 20% off site-wide if you want to get a sex doll from Real Doll. That's their Valentine's Day special. So to be clear, sex robots don't exist yet. What we do have are human-looking, anatomically correct doll robot hybrids. They interact with their users through sensors and artificial intelligence. So just so you know, the first human-looking synthetic anatomical silicone doll was created in the United States in 1996, in Japan in 1998, and in China in 2012. Okay, so currently, both North America and Chinese synthetic dolls, they're highly customizable with various skin, hair, eye color, breast size, nipple and labia shape, and pubic hair options. They're often advertised in ways that are highly stereotypically cis female, fair skinned, thin, young, blonde, and busty. And this is Starkery. This is a Chinese organization, company that created them. They have actually, this is their home landing page, but they've actually also started to advertise darker, black-skinned, and BBW, big, beautiful women dolls, because that's also what people want, just sort of your sort of stereotypical blonde bombshell. Based on, and this is now possible because of advances in the technology, which makes the synthetics lighter. So originally, people were asking for big, beautiful women dolls, but they just couldn't handle weight. And originally, the cost of pigmented silicone was prohibitive for the companies to make a profit. And so now we're seeing diversity in that way. Next month. So in 2017, Robotics released its Real Doll X models, which are now simply just called their Real Doll robots. And these hybrid doll bots, they sport an android head. It's capable of eye and facial contour for speech and emotive expression. It has a silicone body, a conversational system that's designed to address mature subject matter, and an application that links its users to their doll bots and allows them to choose a desired voice, personality type, and even a degree of machine learning that helps the user's interests and preferences get sort of learned by their doll bot. And so by some accounts, Chinese sex doll manufacturers are also beginning to integrate AI into their robot products. So here's where we want to start thinking about their ontology, right? Sometimes these sex robots are classified as smart sex toys, right? But they're also distinguished from sex toys based on their fully embodied, hyper-realistic, and relatively interactive humanistic form. So while some suggest that sex robots' life size and embodied elements facilitate intimacy and emotional attachment beyond that which we would maybe typically experience with a disembodied sexual aid like a dildo, the process of anthropomorphizing is not limited to sex robots. As roboticist Kate Darling argues, quote, "The human form is overrated and overused. We can put emotions into everything from blocks to chairs." So to the extent that sex robots are conceptualized as smart toys, there's reason to believe they may democratize the sex toy market further by destigmatizing toys for men in the same way sex toys have been destigmatized for women. But to the extent that the sex robots are conceptualized as sentient women, or as you'll soon hear, as sex workers, then they may extend the governance of sexual technologies and sexual commerce. And then, of course, to the extent that they straddle these boundaries between toy or sex worker, they present us with this opportunity to really examine our relationship with the inhuman robotic kind. Okay. So as previously noted, sex robots' gendered and racialized human form, as well as their stereotypically, some call them pornified aesthetics, they invoke concerns directly out of the feminist sex wars playbook, right? And so, for instance, Kathleen Richardson, she's a UK ethicist, a self-proclaimed radical feminist, and now she's the author of this book, Sex Robots, The End of Love. She established the campaign against sex robots, based in part on the supposition that sex robots reinforced, quote, prostitute John relations, justifying the use of women and children as sex objects and corroding human empathy, end quote. But more recently, CARS changed its name to the Campaign Against Porn Robots because, according to Richardson, quote, they're porn bots. They're actually pornography. What these dolls are actually mimicking are the women in pornography. They're a version from this masculinist, male, patriarchal point of view, a very degraded view of women, reduced to a form with penetrable holes that can be sold off, commercialized, and circulated among men. And then, of course, there are queer, crip, post-humanist, sex radical feminists, myself included, who are grappling with sex robots' complex relationship to gender and race, but also and ability, but also to desire, sexual fantasy, sexual identity, and non-normative sexual intimacies. So I can't go too much into detail about this, but I'm going to give you a little bit of information from my article on Plastic Fantastic, which is about sex robots and sex fantasy. Okay, so if you're interested, you can look at that article. So in that article, I have to say I wasn't very happy with the way a lot of the literature was helping us understand sexual fantasy, because the knee-jerk reaction is to say, the rad feminists say there is no division between fantasy and reality, and the sex rad feminists will say, well, there's fantasy and then there's reality, and we have to know they're separate. And I wanted something that really acknowledged the nuances of their relationship. So in that article, what I do is I map sexual fantasy research across the fields of experimental psychology, media and cultural studies, post-colonial theory, psychoanalytic theory, feminist, queer, and critical race theory. And that mapping really sort of reveals that sexual fantasy is very polymorphous in form and multifarious in effect. So what I mean by that is sexual fantasy is simultaneously intangible narrative, right? It's our internal thought, it's our internal desires. It's also manifest object. It's our externalized sex toys. It's our externalized paraphernalia. But it's also a productive practice. It constitutes our world. We think it, we materialize it, and in turn, it materializes us and our societies, right? So sexual fantasy is both reverie and reality. Sexual fantasy is generative of private ecstasies and public injuries, and vice versa. And I think as scholars, and society, we want to benefit from a more careful understanding of the co-constitution and the interdependence of fantasy and reality. But here's the point for me. But also their ability to be, and the necessity for us to be able to cleave them apart, right? To, as psychoanalytic feminist film studies scholar Elizabeth Cowie says, for us to, quote, maintain fantasy as fantasy, not allowing it to become the basis for social norms or for, as I would argue, for legal regulation, right? So ultimately, sexual fantasy is a crucial analytic lens for making sense of sex robots, because particularly we're now seeing efforts to stigmatize, regulate, and criminalize sex tech users, and even those people who are externalize their sexual fantasy in a post-digital age. And here I want to point you to the amazing article by Andrew Gilden called Punishing Sexual Fantasy. These are really great analysis of how judges and juries in several areas of law are failing to cleave apart fantasy and reality. And they're conflating sexual fantasy with sexual abuse. They're conflating it, they're dismissing the values of sexual fantasy, they're dismissing fantasy-based defenses, And, you know, they are, you know, relaxing evidentiary standards. And so more and more we're seeing people prosecuted for maybe having a sexual fantasy, going to an S&M chat room. I mean, there's the case of the cannibal cop. I don't know if any of you guys have heard about this, but you should look it up. It's really interesting. He decided he was in a dark chat room where he said he was going to kill and eat with people, but everything on the website was, this is fantasy, I'm not going to do this. There was no, and he went to jail, he lost his job. There's like all these sorts of things. It's really interesting. Now he used real people's names, and so that freaked out people. But anyway, we're not going to go there. I won't go there too much. Okay. So studies are indicating that a growing number of people are fantasizing about and expressing a willingness to have sex with robots. So in 2023, Android, sex robot, and AI robot were some of Pornhub's top trending porn searches. And yet we know little about sex dolls and sex robot consumers. What we know from like 2019 around doll consumers is that about 80% of sex doll owners are cisgender men, and about 20% are couples and women, cisgender women. And emerging research on sex doll users suggests that while indeed a minority of consumers are men's rights activists, right, men going their own way who don't, you know, who are not happy with women, the majority of owners reject misogynistic views of women, as well as heterosexual and monogamous constraints placed upon them and their sexual and intimate needs. So according to Sue's study of idolater forums, this is individuals who love their dolls, who dress their dolls, pose their dolls, come together in communities and share with communities. This group creates an embodied intimate fiction, and their relationships with their dolls, but also their community members, is distinct from their relationship with cis women, their consumption of porn, and to the extent that they have a relationship with sex workers, it's different from that too. Okay, so this is another article I've written. So if you're interested in brothels, let's go. We're going to go there. So overwhelmingly, male owners of sex dolls are largely being deviantized and marginalized in mainstream narratives because they are regularly being depicted as deprived victim loners, sicko creeps, pervy johns, and pre-criminals. And the source of their objection, of course, is multifaceted, but I would say evidence suggests from my research that this objection flows in large part from the explicit parallels that are being drawn between them and rapists, porn consumers, and sex work clients, right? The idea is the robot can't consent, so these men are, you know, raping the robot. If they're treating her like a sex worker, they're objectifying her, they're buying her, these kinds of things. Okay, and so to the extent that sex robots are understood as objects used by men to play out patriarchal ownership and dominance and deviant fantasies, they have been framed as users and abusers, as a symptom of a pornographic public health crisis, or as untrustworthy clients of sex workers who deserve to be stigmatized and criminalized, right? And again, some of this is stemming from our efforts to try and make sense of sex robots' ontology, right? Their private consumption and their public use via brothels, right? Because here's the thing about sex dolls and robots, they're expensive and not everyone can buy them. And so what happened is that people started to make them available through rental service agencies or so-called brothels, okay? And again here, these hyper-realistic AI-enabled sex robots, they don't fit neatly into this history of sexual commerce, right? And so here's an example. Vignette-based research in moral psychology indicates that when people get vignettes, like little stories, that describe sex with a human-looking robot in a bordello setting, the participants of those, in those studies, view the human-like robots as, indicates that they're seeing those as sex. They're seeing that as sex rather than masturbation. But the robot for those participants continues to be seen as a robot and not as a human person. So in those vignettes, the robot is being viewed as a liminal object, as a social agent as opposed to a human agent. And sex with the robot is becoming human adjacent sex, not masturbation. And the sex robot is being interpolated like a subhuman sex worker. And so nowhere is this more evident than in the sex robot brothels and the controversies that have occurred for over 20 years across North America, Asia, and Europe. And so this study is one that I did, and I built on my great PhD student, Delphine DeTeco's. She did a media analysis for her master's thesis, and I used that that body of media articles, like expanded on it, and then did my sort of own analysis of that. But she's doing her PhD where she's interviewing right now clients and sex workers about their perspectives on sex robots, so look out for her research in the future. But, nowhere is this sex robot brothel, this conflation between sex dolls and robots more evident than these brothel controversies, okay? So here's some, again, interesting thing about this, right? Despite self-describing or being described as sex robot brothels, these enterprises were typically commercial venues or private residences that rented lifelike sex dolls by the hour. None of these establishments provide access to existing robots, and similarly, none of the businesses, except for one, provided the services of human sex workers despite billing themselves as brothels, right? This is where brothels or where sex workers were. Now, a standout business is that of Cybrothel, which was established in 2020, and Cybrothel provides a unique analog AI brothel experience, where customers come into Cybrothel, they rent a sex doll, and then that sex doll is brought to life by a remotely located voice actress and sex worker who strategically uses cameras and speakers to see what's going on in the room and then brings the doll to life. So in my remaining time, I want to introduce you to these controversies. I want to look ahead to think about what they afford us. And I want to think about the, what, Dana Luciano and Mel Y. Chen refer to as the expansive transmaterial affections and ways of living that these technologies might bring out. Now, they actually haven't looked at robots. I'm using their queer and humanism to think about sex robots. Okay, so just a little bit of background. The public connection between synthetic sex dolls and sex work that I have been sort of introducing you guys to, it first, as far as I can tell, emerged in the media in 2004. And that's when a Japanese company called Doll No Mori, which was a sort of a defunct Tokyo-based doll rental company. They set out to start just a regular escort service, and then they realized that they had a lot of greater economic potential if they started to rent out their dolls. And what they did, despite at the time, they didn't have the language of brothel, they advertised that they had 4 dolls working for us, right? And so the implicit reference there was that these dolls were employees, not goods, right? Not toys. This emerged as one of the earliest connections between insentient silicone sex dolls and sentient sex workers. And since then, a multitude of sex doll rental services have emerged. They, again, all have been billed as sex robot brothels, and then they were quickly shut down. In most instances, these businesses rhetorically conflated their sex dolls with sex robots and with sex workers. And this was because they were looking to sort of, my analysis says, is that they're looking to impart a degree of animation and intelligence to the dolls, and again, to sort of in an effort to figuratively bring them to life. But of course, the backlash was swift. Detractors, including community members, feminist organizations, bylaw officers, politicians, they all condemned the proprietors of these rental organizations for personifying their dolls, for humanizing their dolls, their sex robots. And at the same time, which was really interesting, they were also doing the same things themselves, right? They were often referring to these sex robots as having been harmed, as being trafficked. And so they were sort of imbuing the sex dolls with a degree of agency. At the same time, they were denying that of real live, humanly intelligent sex workers, right? Who they were all saying were all being trafficked. So in addition to public outcry, political condemnation, police raids, municipal law emerged as a key aspect of the robot brothel backlash. And so I want to talk a little bit about how municipal law works in Canada, where many of these doll brothel controversies occurred. And first I want to indicate, of course, here that Canada's criminal code, of course, regulates sex work at the federal level. But local sex industries, so things like sex toy stores, strip clubs, steam bath, massage and body parlors, and escort services, these are all regulated by municipal zoning laws and licensing schemes. So you can, thank you. Okay, So this is a chart that I borrowed from Danford, okay? So in practice, sexual entertainment establishments are controlled by a laddered approach. Some might call this a hierarchy. Okay, and it is. At the bottom are XXX toy stores. They're the least morally contentious. They're seen as the least of less likely to be a health and safety issue. At the top are brothels. They're the most morally contentious with the most concern for health and safety because of the idea that there's going to be human contact, human health and safety issues, and exchange of money for sex. So although brothels are officially illegal in Canada, they nevertheless operate under the alias of body rub parlors or holistic centers, and they're subject to municipal regulation. So when you look at the Canadian controversies around these sex robot brothels, what was really interesting is when municipal actors were tasked with determining where these so-called sex robot brothels fit in this entertainment hierarchy, they were embracing the brothel rather than the X-toy, XXX toy classification. Again, implying that the sex dolls are more akin to sex workers than to sexual goods or sex toys. And so we can see internationally in Canada that the backlash is evidence of, in the backlash, we're seeing evidence of the conflation of sex dolls with sex robots, with sex workers, but also with sex trafficking victims. And this interchangeability is becoming the grounds for the eradication or the call to eradicate all public commercial sex, including human sexuality, human paid sex, and sex dolls and sex robots in the name of saving women. Okay, and so to help explain this, I want to put them into our broader social context. And of course, many people, for them, when they do their analysis, their broader social context is patriarchy, and patriarchy is definitely part of the picture, right? But in the Canadian context, where many of these brothel debates, the context is also very much a racist rescue industry-led response to sexual commerce. As Sandra Cahan-Chu and Robin Maynard note, within Canada, a web of federal and provincial sex work and human trafficking laws intersect with municipal legal frameworks and immigration laws to conflate sex work with sexual exploitation and to profile, target, stereotype, harass, detain, and criminalize Black, Indigenous, Asian, and migrant women and workers. Right? And so according to Lamb and Butterfly, which is the Amy Lamb and Butterfly, which is the Asian and Migrant Sex Workers Support Network, these efforts have long relied on and reproduced dehumanizing stereotypes of Asian sex workers as unable to speak for themselves and trafficking victims without agency or capacity to make decisions about their own lives. But of course, this history is underpinned further by Eurocentric and techno-orientalist ideas of the human. So as David Eng and Timu Raskola and Shuang Shen write, quote, in Western imaginations of the universal human, China constitutes one paradigmatic site of the inhuman, the subhuman, and the humanly unthinkable, end quote. And then as Serenity Jew writes, this humanly unthinkable Chinese subject is intimately linked to the notion of the idea of the Asian body as economically efficient, excelling in tedious tasks, soulless and emotionless, identical looking and interchangeable, and in seemingly endless supply, in sum, a robot. So we have this Eurocentric, we have this techno-orientalistic history. So assuming you're compelled by this history and this line of argument, my next question to myself and to all of you was, so what do we do with this, right? And of course, an anti-sex robot crowd would say we need to reject sex work. We need to reject the sex robot in order to recuperate the humanity of women, and particularly Asian women, right? That would be that argument, right? But I want to ask us to maybe think about what we do with this through the frame of queer and humanism. I want us to kind of use queer and humanism and to invite us to consider, quote, the processual, dynamic, and diffuse ways in which the category of the queer, the human, and the non-human are continually reconstituted in relationship to one another. And Luciano and Chen suggest this is different from post-humanism and anti-humanism because it's very, aware of this, the problem potentially of calling for us to move beyond the human, because the human matters right now, right? We only need to think about, I'm a criminologist, we only need to think about the fact that in the United States, police, particularly in Los Angeles, would refer to the murders of sex workers, young Black men, as NHIs, no humans involved, right? I mean, this was part of that sort of historic legacy. So human, we don't want to say that humanity doesn't matter, but we do want to ask ourselves about decentering it as the key lens from which we make sense of the world. Okay. So in this last section of today's talk, I want to conduct a reading of Asian women as drawing on Asian American literature and critical race theory as turning towards the sex robot and away from the Eurocentric human. And I'm going to do this through an analysis of an image that accompanied one of the sex robot brothel controversies in Toronto. Okay, so this is actually an article from the Toronto. This was about a Toronto brothel called Aura Dolls that got shut down. And you can see here, this is actually a stock image. As far as I can tell from Getty Images, I couldn't find the origin other than that. I don't know if you can tell, but there are two human Asian women, I don't know from what descent, mixed in with four Asian-looking dolls, okay? And the headline for this image was "Sex Robots Are Dangerous, Shock Warning from Brit Expert." And that was probably the other woman I was telling you about. So the dolls and the women are all wearing silky slips. They all have unexpressive faces, making it difficult to know what the human women are thinking and feeling. The article's title suggests the presence of robots, and the image setting resembles a brothel where clients could pick their preferred service provider. Now, these images could very well be interpreted as proof of sex dolls and sex robots' objectification and dehumanization of Asian women. Slouched sideways on a yellow leather couch atop an oriental rug, leaning on a mostly bare silicone breast or folded forward with an unfixed gaze, the women seem to mimic the doll/robots, inanimate, expressionless, possibly turned off, in both senses of the word, state. Alternatively, however, these images can be read as performing a double move, as purposefully conflating the Asian women with sex workers and the doll bots, and as looking away from the humanist subject, thus decentering the Eurocentric and techno-Orientalist idea of the human upon which these doll robot controversies rely. So I'm going to explain by that reading, okay? So that reading owes much to Luciano and Chen's interpretation of the digital image Grounded 14 by Chicana lesbian photographer Lara Aguila. In Grounded 14, Aguilar poses nude, seated on the ground with her back to the camera in front of a large boulder in a desert-like setting. She appears limbless in a pose that conceals sex and gender, obscuring race, and making her status as a human difficult at first to discern. According to Luciano and Chen, Aguilar can be read as turning away from the demand for recognition within the circle of humanity. By mimicking a boulder, Aguilar enters the very non-human fold where some would place her, effectively displacing the centrality of the human itself. The viewer is invited by Luciano and Chen to view Aguilera's boulderish turn away from the demand for full humanity as a way to explore the overlap between queer studies and the rising critical interest in non-human objects. For not only does the figure of the queer body, quote, unsettle the human as the norm, it generates other possibilities, multiple, cyborgian, spectral, transcorporeal, and transmaterial for living. Unlike Aguila, of course, the women in the previous two images are clearly embodied, forward-facing, markedly gendered and racialized and sexualized. And as with Aguila's metamorphosis to rock, their expressionless face, their unfocused gaze, and their limp posture obscures their subjectivity, transforming them into human objects or subhuman robots, right? And so what alternative ways of being and affections and intimacies and sex and love might emerge if we actually consciously read these women as conflating themselves with sex dolls and robots, as turning away from the demand for for full humanity. And so to answer this question, help answer this question, I'm going to move on to my last part of my talk, which is to have us look at side brothel. Thanks. Right? So side brothel, as I mentioned, has an analog AI offering. And I think it's very important to recognize that when we think about queer and humanism, we also want to think about the indigenous cosmologies and Shinto techno-animism that informs this analysis that I'm going to try and bring to bear on the side brothel example. Okay, so side brothel is one of 2 remaining sex robot brothels. It was established in 2020. It's based in Berlin. It was developed by a group of sex-positive artists interested in, quote, creating a safe space for people to explore and connect with their desire and fantasy through the intersection of technology and our cast of pleasure doll characters. Side Brothel's original doll protagonist is Kokeshi. Kokeshi's maker is a madam and a sex worker, former side brothel owner Alexis Smiley Smith. And she describes Kokeshi as a white, petite, post-gender, blue-haired galactic sex doll with a heart of gold, but also an inanimate medium through which an exchange occurs. She has a backstory for Kokeshi, who is part anime, part post-gender alien, part silicone sex object. And she is obviously, she was voiced by Smith and sometimes is embodied in immersive VR cosplay that I'm going to show you in a second. Okay, so Kokeshi's form, if not her backstory, changes over time. At some point in Side Brothel's evolution, Kokeshi 2.0 emerges, and she's advertised as an interactive pleasure doll sporting a revolutionary robotic system that provides automatic oral sucking, heating, hip pelvic grinding functions, but not AI-enabled software. So nevertheless, Kokeshi 2.0 invites her patrons to, quote, uncover the secrets of machine love with me. And so in addition, side brothel clients can exchange in an exchange, which is somewhat different. Kokeshi's look kind of changes over time. This is a Kokeshi doll. You can experience her while experiencing a 7K 180-degree stereoscopic immersive VR porn experience with the Finnish porn actor Angie Lynx, who is in Kokeshi cosplay. Now, in the article, I do a lot more analysis. This is obviously more like Japanese futuristic sort of imagery that they start having on the website. I can't talk to you about right now, but you can still see there's quite a lot of interesting imagery happening here. Okay, again, it's totally possible to read Smith and side brothel as trafficking in the objectification, the fetishization, the dehumanization of Asian women as alien sex objects, sex robots, but a closer consideration of Kokeshi's namesake could offer an alternative reading. Kokeshi's namesake is a limbless, handheld, wooden Japanese children's doll that has been crafted for over a century. The original Kokeshi doll is rooted in Shinto animism, an indigenous Japanese religion that, as Terry Kita writes, quote, sees life in what we consider lifeless things. Kokeshi dolls, in addition to serving as children's toys, function as other dolls do in Japanese culture to bridge, quote, the separate states of animate and inanimate, and to connect people with the, quote, the forests, nature worship, and animism, the attribution of a soul and a degree of sentience to inanimate objects and the material universe. So Side Brothel's Kokeshi can also potentially be read as an example of Shinto techno-animism, the extension of kami, which is the spirit that dwells in nature, to technology and machines, thus again blurring the lines between human nature and technology. So Side Brothel and Kokeshi, the sex doll robot, provide us with access to encounter the inhuman kind. They literally and figuratively provide the opportunity for individuals to enter into Kokeshi's queer inhuman fold. Kokeshi and Side Brothel provide us with an opportunity to imagine or explore sexual ontology and alterity, and to decenter and displace the Eurocentric and anthropomorphic ideas, anthropocentric, ideas of the human. Okay, so I've run out of time, but what I want to do is I don't really have a firm conclusion, but I want to leave you with a poem. Okay, and this is from Margaret Ree's book of poetry called Love Robot. And this is a poem called How You Make Love to a Robot. Lesson 1, don't watch porn to learn. Robot porn is never any good. A robot would never sizzle and electrocute you. Don't be scared of a robot. Just take your hands and move accordingly. Lesson 2, the first time you kiss a robot, you will feel your heart leap, and then you will cry because you like it. This is all natural. This is all normal. Many people experience this when beginning to make love to robots. Lesson 3, robots all around. Just take her hand and take his and see how she knows exactly how to open wide. Lesson 4, one day you will make love to a human being and realize you could never give up robots. Robots who show you how to make a circuit, robots who help you learn how to love, robots who teach you the limits of your body. Lesson 5, your hands before you touch a robot. Remember them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karaian. That was absolutely fantastic. Any questions? We're going to open up to Q&A now. Anybody online? Feel free to type your questions in the chat.
I know it's better. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Could you say a little bit more about, where you had mentioned that some cis men who use or bought sex porn dolls holding non-traditional views about monogamy or relationships with women? Is that a significant amount? Like, because I think the reason that's interesting for me is like potentially these people could be allies to other sort of queer stuff because they have non-normative approaches to sex and relationships. But to be honest, I'm surprised that that's the case. So I wanted you to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. So I teach a policing sex class. I mean, I have been, I was saying yesterday at Dr. Chittick's defense that I have been going to the Love and Sex with Robots International Conference for the last like 5 years or so. It's been going on for 10 years. And which people might be surprised to hear. But usually at that conference, we have idolaters, people who love their dolls, who are, maybe open to or not necessarily have sex robots yet, come and speak. And they are some of the most lovely people I've ever met in my entire life. And I have videos from at least 2 of them that I show to my class, and I teach policing sex class. And these are individuals that I've experienced personally, that I know, and there's a great researcher in the United States who does a lot of ethnographic research, firsthand research with idolaters. And really primarily, they are in many ways embodying, you've all probably been introduced to Gail Rubin if you're students, and you know about the trans circle, but Gail Rubin talks about benign sexual variation, right? These are individuals who have found another outlet. You know what I mean? It's difference. It's benign difference a lot of the time. And where it's not benign difference, in a minority of cases, it comes from, like I said, sort of men going their own way. But in the majority of cases, it's, I was married, I did date, I don't want to date anymore. I had relationships with sex workers. They were great. I want to try something different. Many of them are just honestly just lovely people who are thinking a lot about what it means. And, they're not delusional. They're not, even though they, will, give, talk about their dolls in the first person, they're the first, they're the first person to admit that they know that this is not a sentient individual, that they're not having psychosis or some sort of, detachment from reality. And so, increasingly, when those individuals come to the Love and Sex Robot Conference and then they see there's a community of people that aren't shunning them and hate them and think that they're whatever, they are so relieved. They sometimes cry at being embraced by a community of individuals who think that they're not freaks. And they very much are aware of the fact that their non-normative sexuality is not the same as, but parallels other people's non-normative sexuality. And so, yes, you're right. I think they do see themselves as potential allies, but it's very hard for them to be out as doll lovers or, potentially one day robot lovers, they experience the stigma. So, it's harder for them to be an active political ally in the sense that they're isolating themselves in order to sort of say we're all there kind of thing. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
In terms of the sex roles in the pornographic landscape, I imagine it's not about immediate gratification. It's not about immediate sexual result. So when we're talking about porn videos that like feature sex roles, we're talking about maybe some sort of play that we can talk about, like play that it's not entirely sexual, or do we have statistics of how much of it is can we consider like sexual in nature, or if it's more related towards are we just playing with them and pretending, or our connection with it is more personal than it is sexual? Like, is there a difference towards those spectrums?
Yeah, absolutely. And most of the research, not to, and we've had conversations about this, not to sanitize, right? Not to sort of take sex out of the lens. Sex is definitely part of it, right? And when you talk to the individuals at the Love and Sex Robot Conference, they talk about all the ways in which it is play, it's imagination, it's helped them rekindle their imaginative side, they're writing stories, they're taking photographs, they're doing all this kind of stuff. It's creativity, it's play, it's experimentation, it's identity construction. It is also sex, you know what I mean? They sometimes feel a hard time, acknowledging that, but it is also sex, but it's intimacy. It's not only intimacy with their doll bots, which sometimes, have an AI application. It's intimacy with the other men in the communities that they're talking with. And so, the existing research right now talks a lot about health and wellness, and all that kind of stuff without denying the sex, because we don't want to sanitize the sex out of it, but also health and wellness for sure. So it's multifaceted for sure. Yeah.
Could we grab a question in the chat here? Clara, I don't know, are you able to voice your
You can do that if you can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you.
All right, sounds good. I hope I'm not too loud, and I hope I'm not coming from somewhere weird. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much. It's a very interesting talk. I'm just sort of curious if you could expand a little bit more on the use of Shintoism in the case of the Kokeshi doll. Is Shintoism something that the artist explicitly speaks about? And if so, how substantially are they engaging with that? I don't know everything about this, and I don't know everything about Shinto, but it does sort of strike me as potentially fairly techno-orientalist in and of itself. So would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, that's a great question and a great point. Actually, Alexis Smiley-Smith, when I have talked with her, she does not. I actually haven't had explicit conversations with her about the origin of the name. And so she does not talk about Shintoism at all. I brought that lens to bear as a possible reading of because of the name and because of its explicit connection with dolls that have a connection to Shintoism, and because this is yet another type of doll that is about play and techno Shinto sort of Shintoism. I am actually not that familiar with, but I do know that there are other individuals in the sort of sex robot community who are talking about that, who are thinking a lot more about that in terms of the relationship of sort of an extension of that sort of indigenous Japanese sort of religious frame to this context. So it's a very good question, and I have an unsatisfactory answer in that it's not part of even my analysis in the article. It's something that I've kind of brought to bear more recently. So yeah, it's a really good question. And you're absolutely right. It very much could be techno-orientalist, except for I think that I would want to look to the sort of Asian scholars that are talking about Shinto technology and to sort of think about what they're saying before I think we've made any leap like that. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so people have a, yeah.
Yeah, what an interesting talk. Thanks all of the best for our research. Very boring. I guess I wanted you to say a bit more about the fantasy reality distinction you brought up in the beginning, and its connection to the anti-humanism. So I couldn't get that with fantasy, one of the kind of things that it seems like some of the legal cases you were talking about, one of the things that they're sort of losing is that these aren't people, right? These are robots or dolls or, and that these are fantasies that maybe are, in some other way maybe occurring online, but this isn't, people are not being exploited. And it seems like a really important distinction and one that seems to be lost. But I guess for me, when I think about that, and I think an operative term there is like something like, in reality, you do want to worry about the people being exploited. So I guess I'm just not quite with that part, understanding the benefit of this kind of anti-humanist lens. It seems like there is a kind of centering of humans and sort of making that fantasy reality distinction. Does that question make sense to you?
I mean, I think so. What I like about the queer and humanism of Luciano and Chen is that they are very much trying to sort of say, look, we're never going to deny the central, like we can't deny the centrality. We can't deny the importance of humanism because we have to, like I said, with a no human involved example, acknowledge that people have been dehumanized, cast aside, sort of not their harms against them, not taken seriously or whatever. And at the same time, centering Eurocentric humanism has also been a source of like a great deal of violation and harm systematically, right? And so I think for the queer and humanism, it's like, how do we think about decentering the Eurocentric human and the harms of the Eurocentric human, while also sort of recognizing that we can't give up potentially on humanity and what it affords us for flourishing and care and all that kind of stuff. So that's what I like about the queer and humanism. And I think, again, they would be very much about like, one of the things that I loved when I was doing my study of the sort of writing on sexual fantasy was, very much the Frantz Fanon stuff on psychoanalytic, critical race sort of theory on like, well, actually, yeah, fantasy is a problem. Part of the reason why we have colonialism is because of fantasies of Black, otherness that constructed a world, and that these fantasies were manifested in texts, in, in like a whole bunch of different things, and they brought a certain colonial world into being. And so we do need to take the fantasy reality, sort of relationship carefully, and recognize, then I turn to Black feminist sort of thinkers who engage in sadomasochistic race play to talk about how fantasy is in fact liberatory for them, and fantasy play is liberatory for them for working through some of those racist injuries and those colonial histories, right? So it's a very complicated terrain that we're trying to think through, and that we need to actually always think through. I am so annoyed by how quickly we cast fantasy aside. And I'll tell you right now, technology is coming for your brains. Musk is already linking to people's thoughts. And this is, we're going to be in a future where thought crime is not just going to be a fantasy. And when people can read your fantasies, you're going to potentially be in trouble, because this is actually a thing, not to get overly alarmist, but this is going to be a thing. You heard it here. Kyler, if you had to hear anything.
Yeah. I really appreciated that kind of hierarchy. That
Yes.
was really interesting.
Yeah.
But when you were speaking, and because you've written on child pornography laws rather extensively, I was wondering if you could elaborate on this kind of like municipal federal divide there, because there's a famous case in Newfoundland, the Court of Appeal, with the plastic sex doll that was reported that was supposedly child pornography because it was too small to be considered an adult or something. But it's like, okay, but it's not human, right? It's like you can't be an adult because you have to be an adult. You're human being adult. Like anyway, like so these categories get incredibly shaky, and so I'm just wondering, like, having just written something on obscenity law, which you've read, like I often wonder if the federal laws could apply, especially in Canada, considering how child pornography laws have been interpreted incredibly broadly, hence the need for proportionate sentencing, as the Supreme Court has said recently. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, or if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I can totally see that applying.
Absolutely. So Canada has one of the strictest child pornography laws in the world, right? Whereas in the United States, for example, virtual child pornography is sort of, is legal because they're not real children. Canada has stricter laws. And of course, we just changed our laws, so we don't call it child pornography anymore. We call it child sexual images, right? It's child sexual exploitation images. But even then, the wording is still fucked up because that was a very legitimate move to sort of say, look, this isn't child porn. These are crime images of child sexual assault. But that doesn't capture all of what we have, right? We have a lot of things that are being captured as child sexual exploitation images that are actually not images of childhood sexual violation. And so, that particular case is a case where it is a representation of a child, so technically constitutes child pornography in a Canadian context, legal context, right? And and so I do think it brings to bear what is, I've made, people have said maybe we do need child sex dolls as catharsis for people who are minor attracted, for whom we have no legitimate ways for them to address their sexual desires, right? And what we typically do is if somebody comes to somebody and says, like even a therapist, I think, and says, I have a child, I'm attracted to children, the first place they go to is the police, right? We have no recognition of this as sort of an orientation that people might have that they don't want to act on because they also still have a moral compass and they still understand consent, but they can't help what they're feeling. And so what are their outlets? Right? They can play with other adults in diapers and try and, play out that fantasy play. Or maybe we give them fake child porn, or maybe we give them fake dolls. And then everybody, a lot of people say, well, it's just a matter of time. Then before that, they get tired of that and they want to move on to the real thing, or, it becomes catharsis. Like, again, this is the thing. Lots of women have rape fantasies. They don't want the real thing. You know what I mean? Lots of people recognize that it's not the same thing. So, we do want to think a little bit about that in terms of the child sex doll context.
Thank you to all of you online. Hopefully we'll see you at the next talk. Okay.